The rain is cold, but the secrets are colder. Imagine being forced to divorce the love of your life to save her, only to realize 6 years later that the danger was a lie manufactured by your own blood. Today we are diving into the high-stakes world of Caius Valenti, a billionaire mafia boss who built an empire on a foundation of heartbreak. This isn't just a story of power. It's a cinematic journey through a freight train of realizations that will change everything you thought you knew about loyalty and sacrifice. From the moment Vivian opens that door to the final, explosive confrontation at the docks, the tension never lets up. You won't want to miss the moment Caius finally lets his emotional armor crack. A transformation that offers a rare path to redemption in a world of violence. Make sure you watch until the very end to see if Caius can protect the only woman he ever loved, or if the syndicate will finish what the divorce started. If you enjoy gritty, emotional thrillers with deep character arcs, hit that like button right now and subscribe to join our inner circle for more epic stories. The rain fell in heavy silver needles, blurring the world around the small cottage, but Caius Valenti stood as a fixed dark monolith against the storm. It had been exactly 2,190 days since he had last looked into Vivian's eyes. 6 years of calculated silence, 6 years of convincing himself that his absence was her only shield. He was a man who had survived through extreme paranoia and absolute security, yet standing here, his hand trembling slightly against the stems of the black-wrapped roses, he felt more vulnerable than he ever had in the heart of a syndicate war. He was the 38-year-old kingpin of an empire built on coldness and the strategic use of fear, but the woman in the doorway didn't see a boss. She saw a ghost. Vivian's breath hitched, a soft, broken sound that cut through the roar of the downpour. She looked thinner than he remembered, her off-shoulder sweater hanging loosely as she pressed her hands to her mouth in a gesture of pure, unadulterated shock. The light from her hallway caught the silver of the wedding ring she still wore, a detail that hit Caius with the force of a physical blow. He had spent years believing she had moved on, that she had scrubbed him from her life as thoroughly as he had tried to scrub her from his ledger. Instead, the sight of her triggered a freight train of realizations. He had forgotten how to listen to the people he deemed powerless, and in doing so, he had ignored the lingering agony of the woman he claimed to protect. Caius. Her voice was a fragile thread nearly lost to the wind. It wasn't an invitation. It was a question asked of a dead man. He took a single step forward, the water cascading off the brim of his shoulders. His expression was serious and heavy with a remorse he had never allowed himself to feel. The billionaire who usually moved with the methodical and patient grace of a predator now looked like a man drowning on dry land. He didn't offer an excuse. He didn't lead with the news of the conspiracy he had uncovered or the betrayal by his own brother. He simply held out the bouquet. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of every unspoken apology. Tucked deep within the velvet petals of the red roses was the original wedding band he had once claimed was destroyed, the one true anchor to the life they had shared before the shadows took him. As she reached out, her fingers brushing against the damp paper, the atmospheric tension of the reunion shifted from suspenseful mystery to an urgent, aching reality. The cold, untouchable boss was standing in the mud, offering her a piece of a broken past. Vivian's knees buckled slightly as the scent of the roses reached her, a fragrance that smelled of old promises and new blood. She looked up at him, her face tear-streaked and pale, and in that look, Caius felt his emotional armor finally crack. The war was coming. He knew his brother and the council would not let this intrusion go unpunished. But for this one singular moment, the billionaire mafia boss was just a man who had finally come home to the wreckage he had made. The weight of the bouquet passed from his hands to hers, a heavy, damp burden that seemed to anchor Vivian to the porch. As her fingers curled around the black paper, the thorns pricked her skin, but the small sting was nothing compared to the ache in her chest. Caius watched her, his expression a mask of serious, remorseful intensity, his slicked-back hair matted by the downpour. He was waiting for her to find it, the truth he had buried among the petals. Vivian's gaze dropped to the center of the arrangement. There, nestled deep within the velvet-red blooms, was a glint of metal that didn't belong. Her breath hitched as she pulled back a stray leaf to reveal the original blood-stained silver wedding band she thought had been lost to the flames of their divorce 6 years ago. Her hands began to tremble so violently that the roses rustled like dry leaves in a gale. This wasn't just a gift, it was a physical manifestation of his flaw. his reliance on power and the belief that he could control her safety by controlling her heart. "You told me it was gone," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the rain. "You told me there was nothing left of us to save." Caius took a half-step into the light of the doorway, the cold, untouchable kingpin finally stripped of his professional armor. "I lied, Vivian. I lied to keep you away from a world that was rotting from the inside." He thought of his brother, Dante, and the council, the methodical and patient enemies who had spent years ensuring this reunion never happened. The gesture of returning the ring was his first step toward a possible path of redemption, a silent admission that his protection had been a prison for them both. The sight of the ring, the same one that now caught the dim light as she pressed her hand to her mouth, was the final blow. It broke her composure entirely. The years of quiet, lonely resilience she had built in this cottage crumbled. She wasn't looking at a billionaire mafia boss anymore. She was looking at the man who had broken her soul under the guise of saving her life. Tears finally spilled over, hot and fast, mixing with the cold rainwater on her cheeks. The atmospheric tension reached a breaking point as Vivian's heartbreak became evident, her soft, tear-streaked face contorting with a grief that had been 6 years in the making. She didn't scream or throw the flowers. She simply slumped against the doorframe, the roses clutched to her chest. The gesture had done what no bullet or threat ever could. It had forced her to face the reality that the man she loved was still there, and the war he had fought to keep her out of was now standing on her very doorstep. Caius reached out, his hand hovering inches from her shoulder, hesitating as he realized that his presence was the inciting incident that would change her quiet life forever. The cleaning house had begun the moment he tracked her down, and the stakes were no longer just about his empire, they were about the woman currently breaking in front of him. The rain continued to lash against the cottage, a cinematic and gritty backdrop to the wreckage of their reunion. Caius stepped into the small entryway, his presence radiating a calm yet intense energy that seemed to shrink the room. Vivian was still clutching the roses to her chest, her hands pressed to her mouth as she struggled to breathe through the shock. The silence between them was a heavy, suffocating thing, until Caius finally spoke, his voice dropping into a low, jagged tone. He began to unravel the freight train of realizations that had led him back to her door, a web of deceit spun by the very people he had trusted to guard his empire. For 6 years, Caius had lived under the shadow of a lie, believing that his divorce from Vivian was the only way to ensure her survival. He revealed to her that the threats which had once seemed so imminent, the intercepted letters, the sightings of assassins near her home, had all been a meticulous fabrication. It hadn't been an outside enemy at the gates. The rot was internal. His own brother, Dante, and the Syndicate Council had orchestrated a massive conspiracy to isolate him. They knew that Vivian was his only true weakness, the one person who could make the cold, untouchable mafia boss listen to his heart instead of his ambition. To keep him focused on expanding the Valenti kingdom, they had convinced him that her life depended on her total exile. Vivian listened, her tear-streaked face pale with a burgeoning horror. The stakes of their separation had been built on a foundation of manufactured fear. Caius explained how he had recently discovered a hidden ledger, a paper trail of betrayal that proved his brother had been cleaning house behind his back for years. The revelation was a staggering blow. The man who faked his loyalty was dismantling Caius's organization from the shadows, much like the ghost of a dead partner returning to haunt a kingpin. The truth was a bitter poison, more lethal than any physical attempt on his life. As Caius spoke, the pacing of his words accelerated, mirroring the urgent tactical thriller their lives had suddenly become. He had spent 2,190 days in a self-imposed prison of coldness, relying on power while forgetting how to trust. Now, the inciting incident of his return had set a clock in motion. By coming here, by breaking the silence, he had signaled to the council that their leverage was gone. The conspiracy that tore them apart was no longer a secret, and the methodical and patient enemies he had once called family were likely already on their way to silence the truth forever. The rain continued to hammer against the cottage walls, but inside, the air was heavy with the suffocating weight of a decade's worth of secrets. Vivian looked down at the bouquet once more, her hands trembling so violently that the black paper crinkled like a dying breath. Nestled deep within the velvet-red petals, the silver wedding ring caught the dim light, its surface scarred by a history she thought had been erased. For 6 years she had carried the phantom weight of that ring on her finger, believing Caius had cast it into the sea the night he walked away. Seeing it now was a freight train of realization that hit her harder than any of his words. It was the symbol of a promise he had never actually broken, even when he was breaking her heart to protect her from his world. Caius stood before her, his dark suit soaked and his expression a haunting mixture of serious remorse and intense longing. He watched her face as she finally touched the cold metal. To him, this ring was more than jewelry. It was the only piece of his humanity he had managed to keep hidden from the Syndicate Council and his brother, Dante. While he had been forced to act as the cold, untouchable boss, relying on fear and power to survive, this ring had been his secret hope for redemption. He had kept it as a silent vow that one day the lies would end. "I never took it off my chain, Vivian," he said, his voice a low, gritty rasp that betrayed his usual methodical composure. "Even when I told you I hated you, even when I signed those papers, it was the only thing that kept me from becoming the monster they wanted me to be." Vivian's heartbreak was evident as she lifted the ring from its floral bed. The soft, tear-streaked face she turned toward him was a map of 6 years of grief. The one gesture of returning this ring broke her remaining defenses because it proved that their entire separation was a hollow sacrifice. He hadn't just saved her life, he had stolen it under false pretenses, fueled by a conspiracy of ghosts and traitors. The atmospheric tension in the room shifted from the shock of his arrival to the crushing reality of their shared loss. If the ring was still here, then the love was still here. And if the love was still here, the danger was more real than ever. By bringing this symbol back into the light, Caius wasn't just offering an apology. He was marking her as his once again. He knew the stakes. If he failed to protect her now, he would lose his entire legacy and his last connection to the man he used to be. As Vivian slid the ring onto her finger, the silver catching the light against her skin, the silence was shattered by the distant rhythmic crunch of gravel under heavy tires. The cleaning house had arrived at her doorstep. The promise he never broke was now a target on both of their backs. The silver of the wedding ring was cold against Vivian's skin, a chilling reminder of the promise Caius had never truly broken. But as she stood in the dim light of the entryway, her soft, tear-streaked face began to pale for a different reason. Beyond the rhythmic drumming of the rain, a new sound emerged, a low, mechanical hum that didn't belong to the quiet woods of her exile. She looked past Caius's shoulder, her eyes widening as two piercing beams of light cut through the downpour, sweeping across the wet trees like the eyes of a predator. The shadows in the rain were no longer just metaphors for their past. They were the methodical and patient reality of the Syndicate hunters. Caius didn't need to turn around to know the cleaning house had begun. His serious, remorseful expression shifted instantly, his features hardening into the mask of the billionaire mafia boss who had survived a freight train of betrayals. He saw the reflection of the approaching headlights in Vivian's terrified eyes, and the atmospheric tension in the small cottage shifted from a melancholic reunion to an urgent tactical thriller. The conspiracy that had torn them apart 6 years ago was now arriving at her doorstep in the form of black SUVs, sent by the very men who had manufactured their separation. "They're here," Vivian whispered, her hands pressing to her mouth as she realized the stakes of his return. By coming here, Caius hadn't just brought her roses and a ring. He had brought the high-level underworld war she had spent 6 years hiding from. The headlights grew brighter, illuminating the rain-slicked driveway and casting long, jagged shadows into the house. It was the inciting incident that signaled the end of her quiet life and the start of a desperate struggle for survival. Caius reached out, his hand finally making contact with her shoulder, his touch firm and grounding. He was no longer just the ghost from her past. He was the only shield she had against the circle of traitors he had once led. The goal was no longer just about reclamation. It was about protecting his entire legacy from being dismantled by his brother Dante and the council. As the first vehicle screeched to a halt outside, the cold, untouchable kingpin stepped fully into the light, ready to defy his own men to keep her safe. The time for words had ended and the hunt had officially begun. The headlights of the Syndicate SUVs bleached the rain-soaked entryway, turning the droplets into silver sparks. Vivian stood frozen, the silver wedding ring on her finger catching the artificial glare as she gazed at the men approaching her sanctuary. The cleaning house had begun, and the methodical and patient enemies who had spent 6 years dismantling Caius's organization from the shadows were finally at the door. But as the first shadow detached itself from the vehicle, Caius Valenti moved with the lethal grace of a man who had spent his life surviving through extreme paranoia and security. The cold, untouchable boss was gone, replaced by a shield that stood between Vivian and the world he had once ruled. He stepped out into the mud and the rain, his dark suit ruined but his presence radiating a calm yet intense power. In his hand he didn't just hold a weapon. He held the weight of a $3 million empire and a legacy he was no longer willing to lose. When the first hitman stepped into the light, Caius didn't hesitate. The pacing of the night accelerated rapidly, shifting from a melancholic reunion into a high-stakes tactical thriller. He moved with a precision that proved his reliance on fear and power was not just a flaw, but a survival mechanism he was now using to protect the woman he loved. Vivian watched from the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth in shock as the man she once knew as a ghost became a whirlwind of violence on her behalf. Every shot fired and every blow landed was a testament to his goal, to protect his empire and survive the immediate threat to his life, and hers. For the first time his power was not a wall between them, but a sword unsheathed in her name. He was defying his own men, the circle of traitors, led by his brother Dante, to keep her safe. As the last of the initial wave of attackers retreated into the dark, Caius turned back to the cottage, his face splattered with rain and a serious, remorseful intensity. The climax of tension had passed for the moment, but the threat was no longer a future possibility. It was an active war. He stood as her protector, his emotional armor cracking as he looked at her tear-streaked face. He had proven that his power was now hers to command, marking a shift in his cold nature toward a possible path of redemption. The shield and the sword had held the line, but they both knew this was only the beginning of the hunt. The adrenaline of the skirmish faded, leaving a hollow, ringing silence that was swallowed by the steady drone of the rain. Inside the cottage, the power had flickered and died, leaving them submerged in a thick amber gloom broken only by the dying embers in the hearth. Caius stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged shadow against the storm, his dark suit clinging to him like a second skin. He looked less like a billionaire mafia boss and more like a man haunted by the ghosts of his own making. Vivian sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands still trembling as they moved to her mouth in a reflexive gesture of shock, the silver wedding ring catching the faint orange glow of the fire. The conversation that followed was a quiet collision of two different worlds. For years, Caius had relied on his coldness and the absolute weight of his power to justify his choices. He spoke of the $3 million arms deal and the circle of traitors that had made his life a constant tactical thriller, explaining that he had sacrificed their marriage to keep her from becoming a casualty in a high-level underworld war. But as the darkness pressed in, Vivian's voice cut through his logic with a sharp, melancholic clarity. She didn't care about the empire or the strategic necessity of his paranoia. She cared about the 2,190 days of silence that had stripped her of her agency. She told him of the cost of her protected life, the crushing loneliness of a cottage that felt like a gilded cage, and the agony of mourning a man who was still drawing breath. Her heartbreak was evident as she forced him to realize his greatest flaw. He had forgotten how to listen to those he deemed powerless. By deciding her fate without her, he hadn't just saved her life, he had erased it. The atmospheric tension shifted as Caius finally turned away from the window, his emotional armor cracking under the weight of her words. In the flickering shadows, he confessed that his reliance on fear and power had been a shield not just for her, but for his own vulnerability. He had been a man who survived through extreme paranoia, yet he was now realizing that the mercy he offered her was its own kind of violence. This heart-to-heart marked a profound shift in his nature, a moment where the cold, untouchable kingpin began to feel the first real hope for redemption. They sat in the dark, two broken people surrounded by a conspiracy of lies, acknowledging that while his power could act as a sword to defend her, it could never truly heal the years of isolation it had cost them both. The cleaning house was still happening outside, but for this brief hour, the only war that mattered was the one fought in the silence between them. The fragile peace of their shared darkness was shattered by the heavy, methodical crunch of boots on the porch. Caius stood instantly, his serious, remorseful expression sharpening into a mask of lethal focus as the front door was kicked open. Stepping through the threshold, flanked by two armed shadows, was Dante Valenti. He didn't look like a man coming to rescue his brother. He looked like a king arriving to reclaim a throne from a man who had grown soft. The circle of traitors was no longer a suspicion. The leader of the conspiracy had finally stepped into the light. Dante leaned against the doorframe, his gaze dismissive as it flickered over Vivian, who sat frozen with her hands pressed to her mouth in shock. 6 years, Caius, Dante drawled, his voice a cold echo of the power they both wielded. 6 years of building an empire, and you throw it all away for a distraction we already buried. The revelation was a freight train of realization for Vivian. Her exile hadn't just been a lie. It had been a strategic move by Dante to keep Caius methodical and patient in his expansion of the Valenti name. Caius stepped in front of Vivian, his dark suit a jagged silhouette against the firelight as he shielded her from his brother's predatory stare. He was the 38-year-old mafia kingpin, but in this moment his goal was no longer the $3 million arms deal or the survival of his organization. His only goal was to protect the woman whose innocence had finally cracked his emotional armor. She isn't a distraction, Dante. She's the only thing that makes this empire worth having. The pacing of the room shifted, the atmospheric tension reaching a climax as Dante's men raised their weapons. The cleaning house had reached its final stage. Dante wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to eliminate the flaw that made Caius vulnerable, the reliance on a love that the syndicate deemed a weakness. The betrayal was absolute. Dante had spent years dismantling Caius's inner circle, replacing loyalty with fear, and now he was ready to end the Valenti legacy to start his own. You've lost your edge, brother, Dante said, his voice dropping to a cinematic, gritty whisper. You're listening to the powerless now. That makes you a liability. As the weapons clicked into place, the stakes became a simple high-stakes life-or-death situation. If Caius failed here, he would lose his life, his legacy, and the woman who had finally given him a reason to seek a path of redemption. The hunt had reached its peak, and the ghost in the suit had to decide if he was willing to burn his kingdom to the ground to keep his promise. The rain outside transitioned from a roar to a steady rhythmic pulse, mirroring the freight train of adrenaline and resolve coursing through Caius Valenti. In the wreckage of the cottage, with his brother Dante's betrayal hanging in the air like gin smoke, the cold, untouchable boss finally shed his old skin. He looked at Vivian, whose soft, tear-streaked face now held a hard, flickering light of defiance that matched his own. For 6 years they had been pawns in a massive conspiracy, orchestrated by the Syndicate Council, but the game was over. Caius reached out, his hand steady as he adjusted the silver wedding ring on her finger, a symbol of a promise he was finally ready to keep in the light of day. They didn't retreat into the shadows. They went on the offensive. Caius, the 38-year-old kingpin who had survived through extreme paranoia, realized that his true power didn't lie in isolation, but in the hope for redemption Vivian provided. Together they began to unravel the plan that Dante had built on a foundation of lies and blood. The pacing of their movement was tense and cinematic, shifting from the tactical silence of the woods to the neon-lit grit of the city's underbelly. Caius used his deep knowledge of the circle of traitors to strike at the heart of the organization, dismantling the very empire he had once prized above all else. Vivian was no longer a witness to be eliminated or a distraction to be hidden away. She was his unlikely ally. Her presence cracked the last of his emotional armor, allowing him to lead not with fear, but with a clarity that his enemies, methodical and patient as they were, couldn't anticipate. They moved toward the final confrontation at the docks, where the $3 million arms deal served as the backdrop for the death of the old Valenti world. As the sun began to break through the clouds over the harbor, the outcome was clear. Caius hadn't just protected his legacy, he had transformed it. He stood with Vivian at his side, the billionaire boss who had finally learned to listen to the heart he thought he had lost. The old kingdom of shadows and deceit was gone, replaced by a new kingdom built on the ruins of their shared trauma. His one gesture of returning to her had not only broken her heartbreak but had dismantled a world of violence, marking his final path toward redemption. It's been a journey of high stakes and deep emotion. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you want to see more stories of power, betrayal, and redemption, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.